can get going on today's work session.
Agent.
Here.
Clegg.
Here.
Halliburton.
Here.
Sanchez.
Here.
Thompson.
Here.
Woodings.
Here.
All present.
Thank you. All right, so first up in the main event right now is sorry, the wind is moving all my stuff, is Eric will be presenting on the budget. Eric, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mayor. If you could just bear with me for one moment, I'm having just a little bit of technical difficulty. I'm on my second device trying to get my shared screen going.
Oh.
I apologize.
Eric, if you can't get it to work, feel free to like email it to Linda or I, and we could be your share screen person.
Okay. All right.
Linda or I, and we could be your share screen person.
Okay. All right. Okay, I apologize for that delay. Can you guys see my screen now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Again, I'm really sorry about that. So thank you very much for the time this afternoon. I've been with you the last handful of meetings that we've had, and we've gone through our fiscal year 20 revenues, our fiscal year 21 revenues. 2 weeks ago, we went through our expenses. The plan this afternoon would be to go through our capital plan and then hit on some of the general fund items as well. As we go through this presentation, I would be particularly interested in learning if there are any items that we can return back to the council with in advance of the June budget workshop. So what I'll start with would be our capital plan, as I mentioned, and I'll kind of go category by category and then kind of zoom back out and kind of talk about the fund as a whole. And as we think about our capital plan, there's really three primary components. It has major equipment, major repairs and maintenance, and discrete capital projects. So as we look at major equipment, that's primarily comprised of vehicle replacements. As we look at fiscal year 2021, we are planning on $4.4 million in total, of which $3.7 million would be dedicated towards vehicles. You may recall last year when we went through the budget cycle that there was a very comprehensive review of vehicle life cycles. And as part of that review, we determined that there were a number of classes where the life cycles of vehicles could be extended. And that review and change in life cycle planning resulted in approximately $500,000 per year in annual savings. Those savings are reflected within this category and within this slide. As we look ahead to fiscal year 2021, a couple of the highlights within this category. One being there are 2 fire engines that had been leased over the last several years. We are entering the last year of the lease, and we would be exercising our option to purchase those engines. The other item of note within major equipment, and this is a change from prior years, is we have built in an allowance for electrification of vehicles and or charging stations. So already when we go through the vehicle plan, we go through line by line and vehicle by vehicle and work very conscientiously to identify opportunities to electrify our fleet. And as we go through that, sometimes there are instances where a vehicle might have something of a premium to move to an electrified model, or it might be cost prohibitive to install a charging station at a particular area for a particular vehicle that might actually have an electric option. So what we've built into the budget here would be $150,000 on an annualized basis, so we can continue with the City Council's goal of having a more diverse fleet and moving to kind of more electric fleet. As I mentioned, when we go through the vehicles, we do evaluate every single one, and we evaluate according to age, operational concerns, mileage, evaluating maintenance calculations. And really the goal is to ensure that the departments have vehicles that are safe and operational and able to accomplish the objective of that particular vehicle operator. And that we don't replace vehicles too soon, nor do we hold on to vehicles for too long. So there really is a delicate balance that we look at. And you can see on the bottom left of this slide, the projection for major equipment does vary. And that's really a byproduct of the fact that we have different vehicles in any given year that are scheduled for replacement. So one year you might have a fire engine, which is a more costly piece of equipment. And then the next year you might not have a fire engine, and you might have minimal number of other types of vehicles needing to be replaced. And as we work our way clockwise around this slide, you can see at the top left, how our planned expenditures align to departments for fiscal year 2021, with just about 70% of the total budget being dedicated to police and fire.
Madam Mayor. Quick question.
Present.
Thank you. Quick question, Eric. On the electrification, I'm excited to see that in there. And this will be a question I'll probably have as we get closer to actually putting the budget together, a little more detail on in various places. Are you guys also making a calculation when you go to electrification of the long-term cost? I know in many cases there's less maintenance, there's lower maintenance costs, there's obviously lower fuel costs, and also any, we're going to have to figure this out, I think, going forward, any carbon savings, whatever, however we want to book that piece of it. So that 150 right now looks like a cost, but I think if we look at it in the big picture, it may actually be a savings. Does that make some sense?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question and for the comment, Councilmember. That is a point is very well taken. And as we've been, kind of developing the budget and the recommendations here, we've been in close consultation with our partners in the Public Works Department and have been talking about ways to maybe capture exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. The next category I'll focus in on would be our major repairs and maintenance. And as we look at major repairs and maintenance, this really covers a wide variety of facilities and expenditure types. So we can look at our public safety facilities, our City Hall and City Hall West facilities being covered within this category. We could also look at our parks infrastructure, playground replacements and things of that nature. And then we can also look at our housing portfolio because just a couple of years ago, the City Council authorized us to include in the capital plan funding for replacement and or maintenance of our city housing portfolio. So this is the first year, the current fiscal year, where we have had a general fund contribution to that, $800,000, and we would see a similar contribution in fiscal year 2021 for that need. Of note, within the capital plan would be an investment for main library major repairs and maintenance. And that's been a topic that's come up in prior council discussions. And as we get deeper into this slide deck, I'll be talking a little bit more about the main library. But for the purposes of the major repairs and maintenance discussion, we have built in an allowance over the next couple of years to address the most critical major repairs and maintenance type activities. Staff has been working with a consultant to develop a condition assessment for that facility. Before the June budget workshop, there will be a discussion with the City Council, bringing forward recommendations for the main library in total, and that condition assessment will play a part of that discussion. For fiscal year 2021, some of the major repairs included are HVAC replacement at the Boise Depot, some parking lot repairs, I think specifically at Fort Boise Community Center. We have annual investments for irrigation, pump, wells, pools, things of that nature, as well as towards the zoo. We'd also be looking in fiscal year 2021 at replacement of the fountain at Ann Morrison Park. If we look at the bottom left of this slide and look at the major repairs and maintenance, we can see that from fiscal year 2021 through fiscal year 2025, it's a fairly steady investment, right around the $5 million range. Now, the difference between fiscal year 2021 and fiscal year 2020 is largely the fact that in fiscal year 20, there were some one-time type investments, specifically around ADA that were captured in this category, some playground replacements and things of that nature. And as we get deeper into the discussion, we'll see how ADA and Americans with Disability Act comes into the capital plan on a more ongoing basis and is captured elsewhere within the plan.
Madam Mayor,
Go ahead.
question again. So Eric, on the fountain at Ann Morrison, I know at one point we had a discussion about doing a fundraising effort for donations to do some of the improvements at Ann Morrison. Are we still planning to try and do that?
Thank you very much, Councilmember McClegg. I believe the city entered into an agreement with the Morrison Foundation where the city committed to some level of funding over, I want to say it was a 10-year period. The Morrison Foundation, and there was a fundraising component as well associated with that, and I believe it was $2 million per. This fountain replacement would go against the city's portion of that $2 million agreement. But you're very much correct. As part of that overall discussion, there was a fundraising component.
Thank you. It seems like, you know, I'm great. I'm fine having this in the budget, but it seems like maybe that is worthy of a further discussion. Even though the city made some commitments, things like fountains are one of the very few things that people seem to be interested in helping fund. And so there might be an opportunity there if we're willing to take it on.
Thank you. And I can certainly talk to our parks partners, and we can bring that forward as we advance throughout the budget cycle.
Thanks.
Great suggestion. Thank you.
Mhm.
So I'll now kind of do a discussion of each department and some of the particular investments that are included in our capital plan. So within arts and history, there's really two primary components. The first, the Heyman House, which was funded as part of the fiscal year 2020 budget. Some of those dollars may need to carry over into fiscal year 2021 due to some delays associated with this COVID event. The other thing that we have included is the annual Percent for Art project. And that is basically a 1% allowance of our investment on capital projects. We allocate 1% for public art. And you can see on this slide, right now I have it zeroed out. That's typically the last thing that we will do. So once we understand all of the capital projects that are included for next year, we will do that calculation and ensure that 1% is dedicated throughout the plan for public art needs. Within the Department of Finance and Administration, there's 3 projects. Procure to Pay, which the City Council considered back in December of 2018. That project is just about ready to launch. A payment system, so a replacement of our payment system, and you might be familiar with the payment system on the first floor in the lobby. And then the budget system, which has been discussed and is actually one of the ways that we were able to generate some savings going into fiscal year 2021. Within the fire and police areas, I'll start with fire, and the 2 projects up top, the Northwest Station, as well as Fire Station number 5, have been discussed over time. As we head into the budget cycle, and really in advance of the June budget workshop, Council will be receiving a separate update on those fire facilities. Within the plan, what we have done is included $3.5 million over the course of the 5-year period for fire station renovations. This is one of the things that we signaled as part of the fiscal year 2020 budget process, that we would be, doing an evaluation and looking at our fire stations as some of them are, meeting the 30, 40, and 50-year age marks, and determining where certain renovations might be required to bring them up to current standards. So within the plan, we have $3.5 million for that purpose. We also have funding in the last year of the plan, and I would put this kind of in the placeholder category for a potential relocation of the fire logistics facility. That fire logistics operation is currently housed at the old fire training center. Within the police department, really the only discrete capital project that's active is the micro district. The funds for that project have already been appropriated, and we're looking forward to that particular facility opening. So moving into the library.
Go ahead. Eric, just a second. Councilman Halliburton.
Thank you, Eric. Just quick question. I missed it on a couple slides ago. You were talking about the 1% for art. Do you anticipate 2021 being less than 2020?
I think that the question was whether or not we anticipate 2021 being less than 2020.
For the 1% for art?
Thank you very much, Councilmember. Yes, I would expect the number to be a fair number lower than the fiscal year 2020. And that number really fluctuates on a year-to-year basis, depending on the capital investments that are included. That fiscal year 2020 number, actually a fair number of that is actually going to be returned at the end of the year because it's associated with the main library project. So that number actually will not go towards those investments. But in fiscal year 2021, you know, I would certainly expect to see something more than zero. But it will probably be commensurate with, you know, historical levels right around 100,000 would be my guess.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, if I could follow up on that real quick.
Of course.
So it might be worthy of reminding especially the newer council members, at some point, you don't have to do it tonight, of the requirements of the percent for art ordinance and how it, in order to comply with the ordinance, what things in the budget are eligible for that percent.
Absolutely.
By memo would be fine.
Okay, yeah, we can certainly prepare a memo on that, and I'll just do a real quick primer on that. As we look at the capital plan, we basically allocate 1% of the total value, except for certain items which are excluded, and those certain items would be like our major equipment, our major repairs and maintenance, and certain soft costs or project delivery costs. So any hard costs are included within that calculation. But I can certainly work with our arts and history partners to prepare a simple memo as well as distribute the actual ordinance itself.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. So as we look at the library, the plan as currently constructed includes an allowance of $25 million in fiscal year 2025. And I'll call it an allowance as opposed to a plan. The mayor is currently in conversation with stakeholders on that particular project. And as I mentioned, when we were going through the major repairs and maintenance, we also anticipate having a finalized condition assessment on that facility later this month. So as we think about the main library project, it's very likely that that project would need to be, you know, rescoped and you know, a vision for what that project might look like going forward. We do anticipate that in advance of the June budget workshop, staff would return for a more comprehensive discussion on the main library. And that discussion would be, you know, what we're envisioning is a joint discussion with the city council and the library trustees to make sure that, you know, there's alignment on that topic, that everybody's hearing the same thing, and that we can have that discussion in advance of the June budget workshop. The other item that we have library related within the capital plan is 1.5 million for Hillcrest Library. And the thinking there would be that with that 1.5 million, we could evaluate options to improve that space. The capital plan as constructed does not include funding for a standalone branch. So that 1.5 million, which has been in the budget for some time, may be able to further improve that facility for the community.
Madam Mayor.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Eric, on that, the 1.5 million was originally put in there to actually purchase a piece of land so that we would have the option to go to a standalone. So as we go forward on this and try to decide what's the best way forward, I'd like to see a scenario that would give us that option as well. Yeah, understanding that obviously it'd be significantly more expensive and would have to be pushed out, but at least it seems to me at least worth a discussion, even if we decide to invest more in the existing, that we continue to have the discussion about a standalone. Thank you.
We can do that.
Thank you, Council Member. As we look at Public Works, really the most significant investment for Public Works is streetlights. And when we talk about the streetlights, it's really LED replacement. So replacing our traditional lights with LED technology. And when we do that, we realize, energy savings for doing that. So as we looked at the capital plan, we had about 4 years remaining of those replacements until we got to our entire our entire fleet of street poles being on that LED technology. So what we have included in this plan is an acceleration to get all of those street lights replaced, so we could realize the energy savings sooner. And with those energy savings, we will be able to funnel the dollars back into the maintenance of those street lights to make sure that our street lights are appropriately maintained. Within our human resources department, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago when we went through the fiscal year 2021 expenditures. As part of the fiscal year 2020 budget, there was funding allotted for facility assessments to evaluate compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. As part of the fiscal year 2021 budget, there's another $200,000 in one-time funding to ensure that we can review all of our facilities. We don't have the results of even that first batch of funding, and some of the evaluations have been delayed because of this COVID event. But we do know that we probably are going to have some level of repairs and improvements that we're going to want to make. So proactively to address that, what we've done is allocated within the capital program $350,000 of base funding to address those needs as they are identified. The other item which we have included within the capital plan are security enhancements for our city facilities. We have some one-time costs that we have allocated within fiscal year 2021. And typically what you can think about those as being cameras, as well as the badge readers that you'll see around City Hall and other facilities to ensure that the right people are getting into the right office spaces. So as we need to replace, repair, install more of those, that funding will allow for that, as well as upgrades and replacement of our security cameras. And then on an ongoing basis, we have life cycle replacement funding allocated.
Madam Mayor, quick question here.
Go ahead.
Eric, on the facilities assessments for the ADA, are we going to end up with a full transition plan, ADA transition plan, or a fully updated one?
Councilmember Clegg, yes, that is the plan.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you.
Thanks. As we look at the information technology department, there are a number of projects which we allocate funds for every year. Hardware replacement, our telephones, our financial system, our ERP. In addition to that, we have funding allocated in fiscal year 2021. We're still kind of buttoning up the final details on what that recommendation would be. But some of the items include conference room technology, upgrades to our suite of Microsoft products, and then certain enterprise systems. We're nearing the end of the useful life for the current version of our ERP system. So we would, anticipate starting an evaluation process where we, look at different alternatives, whether we maintain and upgrade our existing system, procure a different ERP system. Similarly, we'd go through a process on some of our HR systems. As we go through that process and start to identify, what the needs are, in future budget cycles, I would anticipate, the actual capital costs of those systems being built in. Given that we don't know exactly how that's going to turn right now, We haven't allocated a specific dollar amount, but we will, over the course of the next year, again, develop a better understanding and bring forward different recommendations of what that could look like. Within our Parks and Recreation Department, in fiscal year 2021, we have a couple of projects, a couple of discrete projects planned, amenities at Memorial Park and additional funding at Spalding Ranch. We've been, over the last couple of years investing at Spalding Ranch. The funding that we have in fiscal year 2021, it's right around $300,000, is not going to complete that project, but it will further it. And as we get a better understanding of the final vision and what the improvements at Spalding Ranch might look like, we'll bring forward additional recommendations. Also, within the capital plan, we have an allocation for the replacement of the pools at both South and Lowell. Now, these dollar amounts are, I would treat them as placeholder dollar amounts. Within fiscal year 2021, what we'd like to do would be to do some scoping to develop, different options, refine cost estimates, as well as do some public engagement to understand what the neighboring communities would like to see. The last note I'll mention on Parks and Recreation would be a good number of our projects are funded via development impact fees. And if we go back to late 2016, when that report was approved, we costed the projects in 2016 dollars. So every year we have been going back and adjusting our fees to keep up with inflation. So as we get into the budget cycle, as part of our public hearing, there will be a public hearing to increase our development impact fees to ensure that we can continue to deliver the projects that were anticipated. Within planning and development services, 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about this. As part of our investments towards housing, there are $6 million of funding dedicated towards housing initiatives. And if we think back to the $5 million that was allocated back in, I want to say April of calendar year 2019, we used $1.1 million of it for the purchase at Franklin and Orchard. The remaining $3.9 million could be used for project-related costs on that particular site. Knowing that we want to continue to invest in housing for our community, $6 million is included as part of this recommendation. I'll note, of that $6 million, half of it is correlated with the funding that was previously allocated towards the downtown sports park. So as we look at the glide path for the capital fund, that green line really shows, kind of our projected fund balance. But I want to make a couple of notes about that. So the first is, this glide path assumes that we are not going to utilize any of our capital fund balance in the current fiscal year to offset revenue losses or unanticipated expenditures associated with COVID. And we're working through, the plan of that. And as I've mentioned, in previous sessions, it's a pretty fluid situation in terms of our revenues, and we're really kind of evaluating it day by day. But the hope would be that within the current fiscal year, within our contingency accounts, within vacancy savings and other savings that we might have in non-personnel type categories, that we could solve that. The backstop, however, would be looking at our capital fund balance. So again, this glide path does not assume that we would be using that to help solve this COVID event. The capital fund receives just under $13 million per year from the general fund to advance projects. And as we saw major equipment, major repairs and maintenance, there are some significant annual needs in addition to the discrete capital projects that I went over the last several slides. And the last point I'll make on this slide is when you look at the far right and you see in fiscal year 2025, that dip is again associated with the allowance for the main library. And as we go, through the next month and we have more discussion, we can certainly evaluate what is the right number to hold for the main library, being mindful of major repairs and maintenance and whatnot. But that would be the driver for this particular chart, having that drop off.
Madam Mayor.
Sure, go ahead.
Eric, so just to be clear, this trend line includes the annual transfer into the capital fund. So the actual expenditures over those years are significantly more. Am I reading that right, or the transfer is reflected in where the ending balance is?
Thank you, Councilmember. Yes, that is correct. So the transfer is reflected. It's a revenue source. We look at that. We look at that revenue and any other inputs such as transfers from our development impact fees, interest earnings, things of that nature. And then we look at all of our expenses, and the data points on this chart would be our projected ending balance.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
Great. So before we leave capital, what I wanted to do was just touch briefly on the current year impacts that we might be seeing associated with COVID. So I'll make a couple of points. One, there have been some operational delays that have had impacts on delivery of certain capital projects. Seeing delayed bidding process. Our contractors obviously have their own concerns. Also adhering to social distancing compliance on non-essential work. There have also been certain projects which have been delayed to allow for us to assess our financial situation. We would anticipate that many of our projects that we anticipated to conclude in fiscal year 2020 may be delayed into fiscal year 2021. This slide here kind of, touches on some of them. It doesn't really touch on our major repairs and maintenance, major equipment, or public art projects, but it does kind of hit on some of the larger projects. And there have been delays for varying reasons on a number of projects. Now we are basically putting the wraps on our Q2 financial report. And within that Q2 financial report, there is a project by project overview of what is happening with any one of our projects. And we have anticipated completion dates. So this kind of provides a high level overview. Next week, you'll be seeing a very detailed listing of all of our projects and have a much better, a much more comprehensive view of what's happening.
Madam Mayor, in Parks and Recreation,
Right, go ahead.
thanks. In Parks and Recreation, Eric, it doesn't show the various park amenities that were scheduled for this year, which included a number of bathrooms, a couple of shelters, I think at least one playground and a skate park, if I'm not mistaken, out at Molinar.
Are you talking about current fiscal year 2020?
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Were those in this fiscal year, are they going to be completed, or are they going to get pushed into next fiscal year, which will then cause a cascade?
Thank you very much, Council Member. Yes, so this slide does intend to capture fiscal year 2020 impacts. I don't have at my fingertips all of those projects, but I do know that a number of those have been delayed. And I'll add another one, which was the playground resurfacing. That was another investment area that we had in fiscal year 2020, which has been delayed. Again, we'll have that detailed report, and you'll have that for consideration next week, and it will be as part of the packet at the end of this week.
Eric, Jennifer's on the call though, if she wanted to address that. Jennifer Tomlinson is at the con, so.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Clegg, can you guys hear me? Okay, unmuted.
Yes.
So the restroom projects are actually delayed because of CXT relocating their headquarters from Spokane to Nampa. All of those orders are in, and we do anticipate getting those constructed by the end of this fiscal year. And then Molinar Park, the splash pad over there, we anticipate that being pushed off just because of some contracting issues and the scope of work. But there are a few other shelters. Magnolia Park, that shelter is actually being installed right now. We are replacing 3 playgrounds right now. And then we are about to put the playground surfacing project out to bid. So where we could, we tried to move projects along or at least get the preliminary steps done that included engineering and permitting, things like that. So most of those we're hoping to actually have wrapped up by the end of the fiscal year.
Thank you. That's great to hear.
And if I might add, Madam Mayor, I believe also, Jennifer, the Hobble Creek project, the contractor will be on site starting next week to complete the pickleball courts there as well. I believe that's correct.
That is correct. And we are right now working on the playground design for Hobble Creek so that we can get that one out to bid as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. So that was the capital plan. What I'd like to do, it would be just kind of touch base again on general fund items, and again with the intention of capturing items that we can return back to the council on in advance of the June budget workshop. So I have 3 or 4 slides and then a break for questions. So just to go back to the discussion over the last 2-3 weeks, as we've put together the recommendation as it stands now, we had 5 very high level goals. Protect and preserve our financial resources, limit property tax growth, evaluate our existing city legacy programs, and determine if there are opportunities to reposition resources, ensure that we had investments for recovery, funding for various investments, and then public engagement. When we talk about our budget process, and I'm probably going to sound like a broken record, this is definitely going to extend beyond our traditional timelines. We talked at our recent briefings about, kind of this bucket approach. So there are a number of buckets which we have included in fiscal year 2021. In addition, this COVID event is still very new, and our revenue estimates are going to be continually refined. So I would anticipate, 2, 3, 4 months from now, we'll obviously know a lot more than we do, and we may need to make adjustments at that time. One of the elements of the fiscal year 2021 budget was, cost savings. So there was a series of cost savings that were previously announced. The position level budgeting, which was made possible through our budgeting software, which council approved back in December of 2018, as well as an M&O right sizing, where we went through department by department and evaluated historical expenditure levels and brought budgets down to align with those historical expenditure levels. In fiscal year 2021, there are a couple of new areas that we have cost savings in, one being a reduced rate of compensation growth, which we discussed a couple of weeks ago, and we will be, returning with details on that, before the end or before the beginning of the next fiscal year. And then, I guess, a bucket for to be determined base budget reductions. There are a number of areas where progress is underway to meeting that $2 million. And we would, be bringing forward a progress report before the budget workshop on those items. And the goal being that the remaining portion, address sometime, maybe in the fall, maybe, sometime before the end of the calendar year. Other expenditure changes on the plus side of the ledger, there are resources for investments for recovery, $8.8 million, 6.2 million of one-time, a significant portion being those housing projects, and then $2.6 million in the base. We will be bringing forward as much detail as possible on that $2 million that we're holding of base before the budget workshop. We have a number of historical expenditure increases, items that have been discussed with the council over the last, in some instances, couple of years, for either longstanding priorities such as, our new police officers and our plan to grow our staffing over time, to other items such as M&O for the micro district, for Heyman House, and some of our new parks assets. We have funding for departmental workload requests. Typically, there are some level of positions that are added as part of the fiscal year 20, or as part of the annual budget cycle. We do have an allowance for that in the fiscal year 2020 budget. We would propose that we bring forward details on that post budget adoption. And the reason we're recommending that would be we'd like to see where some of the savings come in and what the financial climate is later on within the calendar year. So before advancing certain expenditure items, assessing where we are with some of our other savings goals. And then the last item being, we have an allowance in this budget of $3.2 million in next year, 2.5 million in the base for COVID-19. That could be potential revenue losses if we see this event continue, or have another flare-up of this, a second wave. It could also be for expenditure items that might not be reimbursed in the future.
Madam Mayor.
Sure, go ahead.
Eric, before you moved outside, I have a question on the investments for recovery. So it says 6.2 million one time and 2.6 million base. How long are we anticipating that base expenditure would last? How many years?
The base expenditure would be ongoing in perpetuity. So one example of that would be accessibility. So we have money for the ADA, and we have money for other accessibility type measures, and that would be built in. And for as long as I forecast, I've included that expense item.
So according to this, we're adding about 5 million to our base for new things.
Sorry, council member. No, this is maybe this was a little unclear. So there's 2.6 million within our forecast that I have for investments for recovery. Of that $2.6 million, we talked, I think 2 weeks ago, about there being a bucket of $2 million for different strategic initiatives. In that bucket, we're going to be working to provide detail on in advance of the June budget workshop. On top of that 2 million, there's an additional 0.6 million. So in total, it's 2.6. And the additional 0.6 is accessibility being one of the main items.
Madam Mayor, I just have one follow-up.
Of course.
Where I came up with that $5 million is I was adding it to the COVID-19 contingency 2.5 million base increase at the bottom. Is that base also budgeted in perpetuity, or is that for a shorter period?
Thank you, council member. And I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question in the beginning. Yes, so the 5 million is correct. The 2.6 million base there and the 2.5 million for the COVID contingency and that 2.5 million within the forecast is assumed in perpetuity.
But to be clear, just Eric, to follow up on that, I mean, we're budgeting in you're working in a 5-year window right now, and that contingency isn't being spent, it's being held in case we have reactionary expenses that we have to pay out related to COVID. And so if we don't spend the 2.5 this year, or if it gets refunded, then that would just carry over for the next year. It's to make sure that, like this year, we expected that we might spend $2 million to move families and others experiencing homelessness to safe shelter if there was an outbreak. We needed a place to have that money to respond to those needs if it happens again in the coming years.
Okay, so this would be similar to our operating contingency, but specific for COVID-19 related expenditures.
That's correct, council member.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of upcoming budget milestones, typically we release our budget document in time to allow for 2 full weekends in advance of the budget workshop. So the budget workshop being, I want to say the 23rd this year. So the 12th would, be two weekends in advance. As we kind of go through this, we are anticipating our budget document not being a 300-page document this year, in light of all of the adjustments and changes, and being somewhere probably closer to 30 to 50 pages. So with that, one of the things that I kind of wanted to test out would be, maybe looking at that date and allowing for at least 1 full week. So maybe rather than the 12th, looking at the 16th or 15th or 16th for a release of our budget document. Again, because of all the changes that we've had, the budget document will look different this year. The budget workshop on the 23rd, and then our public hearing on July 21st. So I guess a couple of other questions as we head towards the June budget workshop. Going back to capital, is there any specific information that we can return with that would be helpful for the city council? And similarly with our general fund, as we gear up for the budget workshop, are there any specific items that haven't been covered or that would be helpful as the council considers our budget next month?
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Council President.
Thank you. Yeah, so for me, there's a couple, and I know that we're going to have a further discussion about the housing money, and the amount in there is, I think, probably the good amount, but expecting much further discussion about how it actually gets spent. And I know that's already in the plans. For me, the other, it's not troubling, but it's a big difference, is these buckets and not really having a discussion about priorities within the buckets. And so I was trying to think about how we could do that and help all of you effectively understand what our priorities would be as you're working through some of those things. And I don't know if it's a area by area. I hate to say department by department, but we have public safety, we have parks, we have internal services, and then we have the other. Maybe it's that much. Look at what are the big challenges ahead. What are the potential savings ahead? At a high level, how do those balance out, and what would the council's direction be based on the policy direction that we might want to take? Another way we might approach it, and maybe you do both, I don't know, would be to come back through with the priority-based budgeting on an area by area. I'm thinking of those 8 buckets, or maybe it is on a department level. And again, just give us a high level, what seems to be the things that are popping out? Where are the challenges? Where are the decision points? And allow us, as you're moving forward, recognizing that the work won't be done by the budget workshop, allow us to have maybe a little more comfort with the size of the buckets, because we're understanding what you're thinking and have had some opportunity to review that. Does that make some sense?
Absolutely. Thank you, Councilmember.
Yeah, and Council President, I think that's a great suggestion. And just want to, as I think I've said to you, I'm sorry, I had to come inside because it's raining, and now I plugged my camera into my screen, but it's using a camera up here, but I'm looking down here. That's why I'm looking down. The priority-based budgeting had been worked on and then was set aside for a while. So we picked it back up at staff's recommendation. They'd like to use that process to help us figure out where we can save money and ultimately how we best deploy resources. And so I too would like us to have a, whether it be department by department conversation as we move forward, recognizing it's going to be tough to do that by June, but to bring all the work that staff had done back to us so that we can look at it and actually commit moving forward to use that as the process that helps us like prioritize time resources, dollar resources, et cetera.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, that'd be helpful. And so I'm just trying to figure out how I get my hands around the size of the buckets in the meantime. And so maybe that's the second piece. And the first piece is the, area by area or department by department look at, challenges, potential savings, et cetera, et cetera.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, go ahead, Councilman.
Eric, the two things that popped into my mind in response to this slide. The first was what the council president said. I had anticipated being easier for me to get my head around what I thought would be a more priority-based approach. And I think I understand some of the reasons why we're not seeing that. But I encourage that. I think it's a really helpful way of ensuring that we're properly allocating the resources. And then the second, this comes from my lack of experience with this process and having never been through it. Done many budgets, none anywhere close to this big. I personally am having a tough time getting my head around the whole picture. I think I'm beginning to understand how particular buckets work and how, what decisions and what trades are being made in specific areas, but I'm having a difficult time. It would be very difficult right now for me to answer a question from a constituent that is, tell me in 3 sentences how our city's budget this year differs from last year, or tell me, how specific event XYZ is affecting the budget as a whole. If somebody asked me a question about the Parks Department or about the percent for art or capital expenditures in those narrow lanes, I think I have the information I need to dig in and understand. But the comprehensive big picture is something that I'm, again, new to this process, trying to get my head around. And I think it may be just a war of attrition. If eventually you learn all the buckets, then you can draw those inferences yourself. But to the extent you're coming across things or noticing things or thinking about framing sentences in these meetings in a way that gestures towards the big picture, I know that would be really helpful for me.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Councilmember Sanchez.
Eric, thank you. Just to piggyback a little bit on what Councilmember Bajent was referring to, I think because of what we're going through right now, we probably have more folks watching our meetings and such than we would normally have. And I think it would be great if we could have the presentation take that into consideration a bit more. I think folks are a bit more interested than usual. And since we're all becoming more more visible online than we have in the past. I think taking that to consideration is great, and for sure would definitely love to hear more why certain priorities are picked over others. Sad to see that the Heyman House is one of those stalled projects. But yeah, I think it would be great if we could have it be just a little more accessible. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I guess one more since no one, I'll be quick here. On the
Yeah,
capital
we've got-
budget.
we do have an executive session, so.
Yeah, I didn't say anything about the capital specific information on that, but I really would like to have even if it's a memo or a list of the other capital projects that are out there that we've been talking about that either aren't included in your projections or give a little more specificity to some of those projections. I'm thinking particularly what other parks are out there that, you know, at some point, if we're being honest, we're going to green up. If we're going to do another police district station, you know, some of those things that are still out there so that we can have in our head where we're really headed with that capital budget and not just trying to pick off the few things we have in sight. Does that make sense? Thanks.
Absolutely.
Madam Mayor, I just have one more thing I'd like to add. And it was early in the capital presentation. There was one project that I hadn't ever heard of before under fire, and that was a fire logistics facility. And I know it noted that we're going to get a more in-depth update on what some of those will be, but that was just a completely new one to me. So I just wanted to flag it for the future.
Oh, Councilman Halliburton, I think that you're, well, it stopped. It got really fuzzy. I was thinking you might need to talk with your screen off again.
Yeah, Madam Mayor.
Yeah, you do.
Real quick, I really appreciate the budget. I don't have any specific requests. I think I am eager to hear about what the community outreach plan is going to look like for the budget. That's kind of the thing I'm most eager and excited to learn about so that I can relay that information to people the best I can.
Councilman Halliburton, we were unable to hear you. You're really choppy. So if you would please just type your comments in the window, then they could go in. We'll make sure we had those.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay. With that, shall we move into executive session?
Sure.
All right, Madam Mayor, I move that we go into executive session, labor contract, Idaho Code 742061J.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Halliburton. Sanchez.
Yes.
Thompson.
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
Bajent.
Yes.
Clegg.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Great. So now we are going to be hanging up here, and then we'll be back at 6 at the same link. If everyone will make sure that you leave this fully, because we're going into a different platform for executive session, that would be better.